Gentlemen, please go to your corners. So this, while they're going in the corners, just explain a little bit. We're all friends, and they're all speakers. As you'll find out very quickly. And they asked us if we do a panel discussion. And we wanted to do a panel discussion, but not in the typical format. So we came up with this format where each speaker panelist has an opportunity for 2 minutes to respond to a letter. And we started with the ABCs, and it's just continued on. If you want to watch the previous panel discussions we've had, you're able to do so on the ACCJ YouTube site. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. This, I have to say, this is on the record. We are videotaping this, and it will be put up on YouTube after this. So I neglected to mention that.
Told to mind our P's and Q's, I guess is another way to put it. So let's, we'll start off. So Dave is from Australia, been in Japan for a long time, living in Thailand now, and recently has really gotten into the world of AI and how that impacts marketing and branding and the changes around that. And so he's kind of our specialist in branding and marketing, and now I guess in the combination with AI with that. Is that a pretty good introduction? And he's very much known for his dropping his pants when he's doing presentations. I'm not sure he's going to do that today, but I guess some people find it offensive. I guess once you've seen him drop his pants, you'll know why. Jesper, well, that's right, this is on the record. Jesper over here, longtime friend, TEDx Tokyo speaker. Many of you have probably heard him numerous times talk about Japan and the economy, and he has been one of the few optimists in Japan on the economy and where Japan is going. And then in this corner over here is William Hall, who's been in Japan for over 2 years, I believe. 32 years, or is that 42 years? I don't know. The thing I always loved about Bill is that, and I don't know about it anymore, but whenever an ambassador came from Australia, he'd be one of the first people that they would meet. He's one of the brightest people I've ever met. He's got an amazing amount of insight knowledge around healthcare and research and so on and so on. And so this show, as some people are calling it, they wanted to come and see the show today. Let's get it started. So let's start here. What did I say? Everything I'm supposed to, I believe so. All right, Bill, do you have the clicker? Okay, so the Germans always want to be in control.
All right.
This is the beginning of the end, I think, here. So, okay. Bill.
All right, I'll
lowercase b.
See if you
Bill.
can steal that off him, but okay. So, J, I thought, something I haven't done for a long time, looked at is jail, right? And also I wanted to think, what about the aging society and what's happening with jails, right? So if you look at this, this is the population numbers in total. And you see Japan is number 34 in the world in terms of, because of a fairly sizable size of people here. But if you jump to the next one, can we click, someone click that? Give me the goddamn clicker.
Done.
All right, per 100,000 of population, suddenly Seychelles jumps to the top, right? But then USA. And Japan, you'll see, is 203, very low, right? And the lowest is Guinea-Bissau, just for those who know where Guinea-Bissau is. The next one, please. Now, this is now the people who are actually in jail serving a sentence. There's about 20,000 people in jail. Next one, please. You've gone too far. One back. This is the age break, and also male versus female. And then if we jump to the next one, which is really quite fascinating, for the first time, people who are at the time of sentencing are over the age of 65, now 10% of the total jail population in Japan. The other thing which is interesting, the blue is those who are there for first time, the green is 2 to 5 times, and the third one is 6 times or more. So what's also happening, it looks like, because the Japanese pension system is so hopeless, that people are deciding, let's go back into jail because it's a lot cheaper, a lot simpler to live in jail, right? Right? And so the future of Japan is like this, right? Okay, over to you, yes.
Do you know how to use the clicker?
Oh, that's fine. Look, you know, when I think of J, of course, we all decided we couldn't actually talk about Japan in general, so we all cheated in some way to Japanese jails. I want to talk about Japan pop or J-pop. So, you know, here's the interesting thing. I work with, as Patrick mentioned, an artificial intelligence platform now for doing market research. Quite simply what it is, we take a subject area, we look at the keywords around that subject, we pump it into the platform, it comes back and tells us what are the key narratives across the internet in a particular language happening around that subject. Now, for a project earlier this year, one of the things we looked at was J-pop, okay, in Japan. So this is what's happening on the internet about J-pop in Japan. Now, the scary thing here is you can see the report comes out placing the narrative in one of 4 segments. It can be transient, as in it's something that's happening but nobody really cares. It can be timeless, as in it's a narrative that's really fundamental in the marketplace. It can be transformative, as in it's something that is changing the marketplace. Or it can be tribal, as in it's something that is of high relevance to a very small group of people. Now you can see here J-pop in Japan is tribal. Okay, so you go, that's okay, well maybe it is, except the J-pop is supposed to be at the forefront, first of all, of the Japan's Cool Japan strategy. And even in Japan, it's not that cool anymore, because if you go to the next chart, what this actually tells you is that when you look at the overall effect of the subject J-pop, you can see here that it's somewhere between being depressing and disgusting. So what does that tell us? That you have a cultural factor. This is not to say that J-pop is not selling a lot of songs, records, paraphernalia, concerts. What it's telling you is that the general discussion and the narrative about J-pop, even within Japan, is on a very negative slant. Now, what's worrying about that is twofold. As I said, if Japan is using J-pop at the forefront of the Japan cool messaging leading up to 2020, it's going to, unless somebody comes along and does something amazingly different that's called J-pop, it's a downward cycle. It's not having a big effect outside of the marketplace either at the moment. The other depressing thing is what this says about young people in Japan, because J-pop is still the dominant form of music entertainment in the country, but it's depressing people. So now everything else the guys we talk about today, and if we get into any subjects you want to talk about the relationship of why it is that young people in Japan sort of have a negative attitude to life, number one reason is their music.
Let's hope they don't end up in jail.
You see, my colleagues have all the fun, jail pop. I'm the economist and finance guy here, so sharpen your pencils here. I'm going to talk about JGBs, junk bonds in drag. Look, this is the total amount of debt that is outstanding, and basically you see it's pretty much a one-way street. You know, it's basically shot up to what's now, you know, just the government bonds outstanding is more than 2 times of the Japanese economy. Now, you're all businessmen, or some of you are. Look at what's actually happening here. When you look at, yes, there's an enormous amount of JGBs outstanding, but wow, the cost of running that debt has actually started to decline. And that's, of course, because we now do have 0 or sometimes even negative interest rates. So Japan has opened a new paradigm. Yes, you've got an enormous amount of debt. The debt keeps on growing, but the cost of servicing that debt actually is declining. Isn't that nice? Isn't that how you would want to run your business? Now, the interesting thing is that the Japanese people, Japanese professionals, Japanese institutions are actually not stupid, right? Their ownership of those junk bonds, of the JGBs, has actually been steadily declining. And you see that now it is, yes, the Bank of Japan that has actually become the single largest owner of government debt going on. So it's wonderful. You've got one part of the government issuing about 40 trillion of debt this year, and you've got another part of the government, the Bank of Japan, buying 80 trillion yen, more than 2 times of the debt that is being taken out. This is wonderful. This is how an economy is supposed to work. But the interesting thing is that also foreigners have become big buyers of Japanese government debt. So the central bank is buying, and global institutions, in particular the Reserve Bank from China, has been increasing its reserve holdings of Japanese yen. What does that mean? I think it means that the yen continues to float on water. And I do dare you to try this. Please do send an email to me. The yen is the only currency from the G7 that actually does float on water. So on your next boring conference call, please try to do so. Thank you.
I just had a J pop in my head. Jamana Oji-san. How many people know any Jama Oji? Jamana Oji-san, yeah? Biggest challenge in Japan right now is Jama Oji, old men who get in the way. If you look at the need for exponential change moving forward, definitely the Jamana Oji-san. Good guys, they went to the right college, did good things, stayed in the company, rode the escalator ride up, and now they're stuck in a situation where there's no more lifetime employment. The younger generation below them saying, get out of the way, and the president saying, we need change. So Jama na Oji-san. Jama Oji is the biggest challenge that we're facing in Japan right now. The solution is to allow them to create environments where people can prototype and innovate things and competitions so they become the cool Jama Oji who can actually maybe get the women half their age that they're running around trying to chase.
So we're moving on to K, since I ended on the subject of ownership, I want to talk a little bit about ownership in the private sector, keiretsu. You remember Japan in the mid to late 1930s, there were 8 families, the Zaibatsu families, that controlled slightly more than half of the Japanese economy. And that was the Zaibatsu. And when the Americans took over, one of the key focuses was to break up the Zaibatsu system to make sure that this sort of feudal capitalism could never, ever happen again. That's why the inheritance tax system in Japan is designed to wipe out all family wealth over 2 generations. That's not because of the Japanese, that is because of General MacArthur and his advisors. So much for the inheritance tax stuff. Keiretsu, if you look at the ownership relationship after the war, yes, the big Zaibatsu families were broken up, but of course, Japan being Japan, they were very crafty, and they developed keiretsu, loose corporate relationships that were solidified by the cross-shareholding structure. So my bank owns a bit of my car company, owns a bit of my steel company, etc., etc. And you saw that this mochiai, the cross-holdings, the cross-shareholdings, at the peak of the bubble economy, again, about half of the equity of corporate Japan was tied up in these corporate cross-shareholdings. So if you were not part of the Mitsubishi family, if you were not part of the Sumitomo family, you had no idea what was actually going on. You had no access to proper accounts. You had no access to how decisions and corporate strategies was going to be made. The good news is that the keiretsu system has basically dwindled almost completely. It's now down to about 6% of the equity. And we've got a great example that, yes, corporate governance has fundamentally changed. What am I talking about? Toshiba. Toshiba is the last, sorry, is there anybody here from Toshiba? It's a perfectly fine company. That does make excellent refrigerators. Toshiba, why am I saying this? Toshiba is the last zombie. It's the last of the conglomerates, right, that really doesn't have a proper business model. And what's interesting is that you can show that governance has changed because nobody from the Mitsui Keiretsu is raising their hands to try and bail it out. And I think, the fact that Toshiba is having such problems, is actually indicative that Japan has fundamentally changed. It used to be, yes, an insider capital system. Now it is an outsider capital system, which does create great business opportunities for all of us doing business here. Now, having said that, what is interesting, if you look at the overall holdings, who owns corporate Japan, the interesting thing is you see that global investments have gone up from 4% to about 1/3. Thank you very much. You see that the private sector, households or private institutions, have not really increased their direct ownership significantly. But what is interesting is that, yes, thank you, it is communism that works, because the public institutions, basically have become the biggest, the biggest in terms of flows, right? Big investors here. And it's particularly interesting to see that our friends from the Bank of Japan are not just buying the government debt, but yes, thank you, they're also buying equity in the Japanese market. So it is communism that works. Thank you.
Would you kindly share the clicker with the others, please? Thank you.
So, as Patrick mentioned, I spent half my time living in Bangkok. And just next to where I live is a branch of a chain of a Japanese second-hand chain. So basically, each of these stores is full of stuff that they've collected second-hand sales from Japan. They resell in Thailand, Malaysia, all through Southeast Asia. What's interesting is it's all second-hand product. But lately, or a little while ago, I noticed that there was an awful lot of these things that were in perfectly good, sealed, brand new packaging. Now, everybody in the room, I noticed that nearly half the people in the room at least have got their phones sitting on their laps and they're surreptitiously trying to do stuff under the table. How many of you have one of these dingle-dangle things hanging off your phone anymore? And think about your own staff when you go back to the office. If you'd gone back only a few years ago, everybody, male and female, had them. Now it's disappearing off the face of the earth. This got me thinking. First of all, I asked the owners, how come you got this stuff? Well, the manufacturers give it away to us now to sell overseas because nobody in Japan buys it anymore. Okay, so there's a change in style of our keitais. Next chart. Oh, sorry, thank you. Obviously, everybody in the country uses a keitai in some way, but how do we use them? Now, a lot more anthropological work is being done more than ever in the way in which we use our mobile phones. For example, you remember about 25 years ago, there was a lot of stories about how by this stage in your life, because we basically, the people in this room, especially those that are getting close to my age, have had a mobile phone for 25 years, and theoretically we should either have massively arthritic or massively giant thumbs, right? Of course, that hasn't quite happened. But what we do know from the anthropological studies is that different nations hold their phones differently, they type differently, they interact with their phones in different ways. What's really interesting about Japan is it's leading the way in which we have to think about interface in a different way, primarily because of line. Now, the only other marketplace, I don't know if you know this, but the two most successful markets in the world for line are Japan and Thailand, and that's the two countries I split my time between. Now, we could go on to why line is so successful in those markets versus others, but the most important thing is this. How many of you have a line account? Yeah, of course you do. You have to, because otherwise you can't talk to your staff. How many of you have ever held a 20 exchange conversation where you write to something, they write back, 20 exchanges, not a single word, just emojis and stamps? Okay. That's why this room is full of totally abnormal, weird people. Because I can tell you, actually a recent study I saw, that people between 60 and 70 in Japan, there were already 15% that were holding whole conversations just using emoji and stamps. Okay, the reason for that primarily is because they, at 60 plus, they're primarily doing that to reach out to their grandchildren and be able to have conversations. But the reason I raise this all is, in the very near future, you're going to start seeing phones where we think of a phone, and when I click on my smartphone and you click on your smartphones and you want to type anything or you want to send a message, you see the alphabet, you know, the old traditional keyboard. The first thing you're going to see is an anime or an emoji keyboard. You'll have to look up the letters because that will be the abnormal way to communicate on a phone. And we're already starting to see a couple of platforms start to play with that, and Japan will be the test market for this because it's the heaviest market in the world for person-to-person, stamp and emoji-only conversations. Be prepared for it.
Thank you. Bill? Yeah, go ahead. I clicked it for you, the first one. I can do it. You want to
K, I'm going to do knees. People always forget about knees, but they're rather important. So there's 112.5 million people with some sort of, in Japan, knee or joint problems, okay? And this is a horrible slide, but on the left-hand side is a good knee. The right-hand side, what's happened, you lost your cartilage and you get bones, and it's very, very painful, right? So you start feeling this when you get in your 40s and 50s. So gentlemen and ladies in the room, this is getting to be the time for many of you. This is going to be a problem. And what is your biggest problems faced? Going up and down the stairs is the biggest problem in Japan, right? Followed by sitting on a Japanese tatami mat, right? And the other ones you can see there, right? Then the problem is, this is the problem, all right? This is like a normal Japanese house where you see the stairs going up, always very slippery, and everyone's wearing slippers, right? And so there's a very large business opportunities coming out of all this now is, for example, home elevators. This man's looking down thinking, I better buy myself a home elevator. Because, you know, some of the studies you've done, they said, you know, when I get up in the morning, it's like looking up, having to climb Mount Fuji every day, you know. It's really horrible if you have these bad knees, and you have to get injections, right? The example, well, the knee supporter business is quite large. A lot of supplements coming out. You have chondroitin, glucosamine, etc., very large and growing business there. And recently coming out now will be on the left-hand side, the ability to do 3D knees, which will actually fit your knee, as opposed to taking off-the-shelf knees, right? So you will be able to eventually now increasingly do this direction. And the cost to the economy, roughly speaking, we did a study a couple of years ago, for pain was about 370 billion yen, which was second biggest cost to the economy in terms of absenteeism, having to stop work to look after old people, etc. Number one, over $1 trillion was, of course, mental health. So I'll stop there. Next one.
Have the clicker? These guys are trying to hand me everything but the clicker. It's kind of interesting. Okay, kindergarten. Everything you need to know you learned in kindergarten. Often, I've been working with children, kindergarten, elementary school age for years, and often when I look at adults, I look at the kindergarten with them and I can find out a lot. So when you're in a conversation with somebody, look at them and try to imagine the 5 or 6-year-old. And more likely than not, that's what's driving who that person is, the kindergartner. I think we're on to L's now.
Just on kindergarten, a lot of people don't know this, but my first 10 years of my working life in Australia, I was a children's librarian. I spent my whole life reading stories to kindergarten kids. First of all, it was physically and mentally the hardest job you will ever have. But the reason for that is because I've never heard more wisdom than I've heard from a 4-year-old. So actually what you should do, I think, is as your business, explain it to your 4-year-old niece, nephew, grandchild. If they can figure out what you're talking about, then you've got a product.
Parents think they're going to teach their children a lot. It's the reverse. It ends up being the children that teach the parents a lot more than they teach them. L's.
L. So when I was working in Japan here for McCaughan Erickson, the ad agency, a few years ago, we did a global study on wellness. And one of the things we found out was that when you ask people in countries all over the world who were the most well people in the world, the overwhelming answer was Japanese. And that was defined by 3 things that people all over the world said, well, yeah, the reason why Japanese live the longest, are the healthiest people, etc., is because of, first of all, they eat sushi every day. And only eat sushi every day, apparently. They are all Zen fanatics. As all our Japanese friends in the room know, of course, you'd much rather be off, silently thinking or something. And toilets. Because, of course, we all know that the number one thing that any tourist, when they come to Japan, remembers is the toilet. Okay, and we do know, of course, and all the stories the last few years, yes, you hear the stories about some Japanese tourists trying to literally take a high-end Toto toilet onto the plane with him to go back, right? But actually, this is a very interesting thing. Now, those of you that have heard me speak otherwise will know that my 2 favourite subjects are indeed talking about underpants and toilets. But, in this particular case, loos, that's the L, loo for toilet, right? So a bit of a cop-out. But think about loos in Japan and what they say about Japan. Recent research we've been doing looking at the image of Japan overseas and Japanese products and Japanese industry overseas. And probably Japanese loos sums it all up. We all think that it's all summed up by these very high-tech loos. The question we were asked by one of the world's leading toilet manufacturers was, yeah, but that's actually been around for like 25 years, but we can't sell any of these anywhere else in real terms. Yeah, we do sort of, but we don't make any money by selling them in America, Western Europe, China, or anywhere else. Why is that? And one of the things we looked at and discovered was, first of all, in relation specifically to toilets, and then more generally to Japanese products, from cosmetics through to high-tech, through to cars, all sorts of things, is Japan is a producer of, interesting stuff. At its base level, good quality. Interesting niche products, but I don't really think they're going to work. Not that they won't technically work, they're not sellable. And this goes back again to, I guess, my ongoing theme, which is when Japan looks towards 2020, what is being done within the marketplace to produce products and services and message those to other parts of the world, where we're starting to take, instead of being hugely niche products, toilets, really fancy up-end market toilets. But think about, if you're a foreigner, your own hometown. How many people in that town own one of these things, and why don't they? Yeah, well, it's Japanese. It's sort of cool when you go to Japan, but it's not real world, is it? And somehow Japan has got into this niche-y place, and so our loos here represent the fact that we are a niche market producing niche products. It's fine, but it's very hard then to persuade people overseas to look at Japanese-based products as something that's more mass market and obtainable.
There's some predictions out there that the toilets, when we wake up in the morning and we relieve ourselves, that the information that we're going to receive is going to tell us whether we have enough of the blood sugar level, cholesterol, all the different kind of medical tests in some ways are going to come through us just going to the bathroom in the future. So looking forward to those days and that level of technology. Bill.
You mean singularity toilets?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, okay.
The big S on them.
I'm going to talk about licenses, particularly L for license for elderly drivers. As of April this year, everyone who turns 75 now has to take a dementia test before you're allowed even to do the basic testing, right? And you look for dementia, and if there's a problem, you have to go and see a doctor. And the reason for this is because a lot of, you've probably read in the newspapers, a lot of people are driving up the wrong side of the expressway or pushing the wrong pedal, left or right pedal, and so on, right? And at 70, you have to do a new practical test. I can proudly say I passed the 71. It's quite good. It's because, for example, you know, when you do your eye test, you have these little things, this like that. Not just that one, you have a moving one that comes towards you as well, to see what your reaction time is when it's coming. And then a nighttime one, when the lights are on right in your eyes, and see how long does it take you to do that. Then they put you in a video game, like in the video game, and you have to push the pedal to see whether you push the accelerator or the brake correctly or incorrectly. And if you don't do all that, you fail. So they're working to do that. Now, why are they doing all that? Because there are now more people over the age of 65 dying in traffic accidents than the total population of the rest of Japan, right? And it's taken over, right? And so what's happening now, they've got a new concept which says, okay, we're going to take your license off you. Under the new system, they're expecting to take about 15,000 licenses off people over the age of 70, 75. Now, what you can do is, it's a neat concept, voluntarily surrender your license, right? If you want to, if you feel comfortable about that. And if you do, because people use a driver's license in Japan also as a form of identification, right? So they will now create a new one which says you've voluntarily given up your license, you can carry that, and in some parts of Japan you're getting a 10% off taxi ride or 10% off the ramen, etc., right? Now, which is good. The only problem is, how the hell do you get to the ramen shop, particularly in the countryside, right? Because in the countryside, you know, buses have stopped running, trains have stopped running, and so a lot of the old people don't want to stop driving, right? But they're going to be stopped driving. So this is going to be another very, very major problem for Japan going forward. That's it? Yeah.
Thank you. You going to take that over there? Yeah. Oh, you want to click it forward, I guess? So one of the challenges around Uber not taking off in Japan has been because of the regulations, but it is starting to take off a little bit in the countryside because of this exact challenge.
Learner's permit. Elle, I really wanted to talk about love, but
that's what I wanted to talk about.
We let Patrick do that, in the evening hours. Liquidity. There's an enormous amount. I mean, Japan is the absolute king of liquidity around the world. If you look at whether it's the household sector, Mr. and Mrs. Watanabe with all this tansyokin, all this mattress money, or whether it is companies, just enormous amounts of liquidity, piled up, just money sitting on deposit, earning zero interest. Companies in Japan, when you look at the liquidity here, are the world champions. This looks at the liquid balances, so cash and marketable securities, and I've divided it into the GDP so that you can do a cross-border comparison. And what's very interesting is that, yes, Japan is unbelievable, right? From 20% of GDP 10 years ago to basically 130%. So 1 times of GDP it has grown. When I showed this chart about 6 months ago to Prime Minister Abe, he was literally frothing at the mouth. Because, I can double my GDP if only these companies would do something with the money. Now, what's interesting is that this is a global phenomenon. Even France, right? China, which supposedly works so hard. The United States, Apple having $400 billion of cash on its balance sheet. It's very interesting, right? You see actually only one country here, Germany, that has seen a decline. Now, why is that? It's because of Angela Merkel. Germany has got a very nasty government. They actually are not afraid to do industrial policy. So Germany, as you may know, a couple of months ago, 6 months ago or so, introduced legislation by the year 2030, the only cars you're allowed to sell are electric cars. So when you're Volkswagen, when you're Daimler, whoever you are, now you have to invest in new factories because Kisei Kyoka, a tightening of rules and regulations, is actually forcing productive investments. The other reason, of course, is that Germany has corporate governance that is completely different from anywhere else. We talk a lot about corporate governance, it's a very important issue, but the reality is that Germany is the only country where the labor unions actually sit at the table. So if you and I make money, how are we going to distribute the money? The labor union definitely gets its fair share. And as a result of that, it's interesting, you've got this liquidity thing. Now, where does Japan come into all of this? There's always this idea, yes, Japan is not very nice to the capitalists. They don't pay a lot of dividends, they don't do a lot of share buybacks, they don't really care about return on investment, but Japan cares about its workers, right? That's the great myth. Well, labor actually doesn't get paid either, which is quite shocking, right? If you look at workers' compensation as a share of value add, you see that Japan, for large companies and for small companies, is actually significantly below the United States of America. America pays capital and labor. Japan pays neither capital nor labor. Thank you. Great?
Think about the hybrid electronic vehicle marketplace. Remember that piece of research I showed you before? Using the same platform, if you were to look at what were the key narratives going on across the internet in Japan about hybrids and EVs, you would think intuitively that it would be all on the right-hand side. It would be transformational subjects, it would be tribal subjects for a bunch of people that are nerdy and really into all this sort of stuff. Well, we did the research in Japan, and this is where all the narratives appeared. Right? Nearly all of it is in the boring side. And you go, well, and those are narratives that include things, everything from the narrative around Prius and around the Leaf and around different aspects of Toyota and its hybrid models, etc. It's including Tesla and different aspects around Tesla, around Elon Musk as a person. It's all there on the boring side. Now, why is that? If we did the same research in the United States or most Western countries, it's all going to be on the top right. So why is that? Because unlike the rest of the world, and this goes back to my previous comment about selling Japan stuff overseas, the problem with Japan is it's complacent about innovation. It's it's subject to the highest level of best quality stuff. So it takes everything for granted. If you think about the hybrid EV marketplace, anywhere else in the world, it's news because it's a minor portion of the car market. It's the leading edge. It's usually debated by governments. It's Mr. Trump getting rid of all EPA functions in the United States, whatever that might be. In Japan, it's now 12 years of one of, if not the single largest model being sold in the marketplace every year is a hybrid car. Well, hybrid's nothing. Hybrid's nothing. And this goes to one of the fundamental issues about Japan in terms of Japan being able to sell stuff overseas. Japanese, as a marketplace, is treated to the best quality, assumes that this is all so what, and forgets about the basics of how to deal in a marketplace where all these advanced technologies are actually, they're the big news, and they're the things that are growing things. So the difference in the terms of the way in which you absorb your understanding of technology locally is not being transformed into how you're going to sell it overseas.
You just came back from the Indianapolis 500. I was there on Sunday. Wonderfully, a Japanese driver won. Everybody thought I was because I was there. I said I don't have that much power. Interesting enough, though, a lot of people in America, one person driving a car. If you're in an electric car now, you can be in the carpool lane, which I thought was kind of interesting. Another is a survey was just done. I think it was 3,000 people. Most innovative company in America right now, 49% of the people said Tesla. Bill?
Powered by Panasonic.
Not Toshiba?
Not Toshiba, Panasonic.
So this is my favorite chart. You just switch it across and then I'll tell you what it is. Can someone switch that one? Who's got the clicker? Is that?
I do. One of them?
Thank you. So what it tells you is, for the first time in 130 years, the number of babies born in Japan has dropped below 1 million. So since the Meiji Restoration, right? Which is a staggering sort of statistic. The other thing, if you sort of see in the middle, there's a little dip down in there, in the middle there, right? That is 1966, and can anyone tell me what happened in 1960? Oh, Guy knows. That's, you're cheating. You two know. Okay, everyone else doesn't know. Fine. This is the year of the fiery horse. It comes around once every 60 years, and women born in that year will grow up to kill their husband. And so you'll see that belief.
Now we know why the population is declining.
Yeah. Yes.
The power of birth control.
Yeah. Yeah, Hinoma, right? So that had an effect on the total population of Japan, right? Now I went back to the 1906, the same thing happened. It dropped in 1906, which is 60 years earlier, and the next time will be 2026. If we're still around to see that, please take a note and just memorize that. So if you're still around in this earth, see what happens to the Japanese population birth in that date. Okay? Thank you. Next one, yeah. Who's up?
Favorite number, Dave?
Okay, my favourite number is 3. Now, again, I spend half my time in Bangkok. It just happens I live on what's called Japantown. It's the Japanese district of Bangkok. 2 ex-employees of mine here when I was living in Japan live literally within a few hundred metres of me. Both ladies, both in their mid-30s, both pregnant now with their 3rd child. Now, that was quite interesting when they both told me within the same week, oh, yeah, I'm pregnant again. Right? Yeah, 3rd kid. Wow. Yeah. And I asked one of them, I said, wow, that's pretty unusual. You know, Japan today, women normally have, like, not even replacement rate, right? So what's the story of that? He said, oh, no, all my friends are having, like, their 3rd kid. So I went to the kindergarten where they have their littlest children. And it's a kindergarten that's made up primarily of Japanese women. It's self-funded. It's not their corporate parent, their husband's corporation paying for the kids to go there. They have to pay it out of their own pocket. And what every woman told me there, they either were expecting or expected to have 3 children. Now, why is that? Well, one was basically that being expat wives, they're bored. So they're literally, I'll have a 3rd kid because I've got nothing else to do. Okay, that's fair enough. Second thing was, I was brought up, nearly all of them was brought up with only one sibling, usually a boy, a brother. And they said, as my kids grow up, I want to have a boy, but I want to have 2 girls. Because I don't believe a girl can grow up properly without a sister. And I really missed that. Very interesting. I went and then talked to the husbands. They didn't think the same way about the boys. It was like, yeah, whatever. In fact, their complaint was that the wife made us have 3 kids. You know, it's going to get expensive. Now, it's interesting. This is all this year. So in the year that Bill's talking about where there is a decline, because overseas Japanese are having this. I checked with similar kindergartens in Singapore and in Kuala Lumpur and got basically the same findings. So that says to me 2 things. One, if we want to solve the Japanese population problem, just send all the young couples to live overseas for a couple of years and they'll pop out 3 kids. Okay? What it also says is the relationship, when they were talking about the fact they want to have 2 girls, so they have sisters. And why do they want to have sisters? Well, probably at least one of them will never get married. This is the mothers talking about their 2, 3, 4-year-old daughters. Well, at least one of these 2 will never get married because, you know, just look at my life. Japanese women aren't going to get married anymore because we don't need to get married anymore. And that probably, those 2 things sums up why we're now in the first time ever, or 100 million births.
My favourite number is actually here. It's basically 10. You know, there's this myth about the Japanese economy that, oh, there's not a lot of charity, there's not a lot of volunteering. Actually, that is completely not true. In fact, the great thing is that a new economy, a genuinely new economy is emerging in Japan, which is the not-for-profit, the volunteer economy. And you find that in terms of the percentage of the people working, that it's now 10%. And in terms of the contribution to GDP, it's you know, about 5.3%. And you can see that that's pretty comparable to what you've got in the United States of America. Now, what's very interesting is that actually the NGO, the MPI, the non-profit and volunteering economy in Japan is one of the highest growth sectors in the Japanese economy. You find that the non-profit economy in Japan since Fukushima has grown on average every year by about 5.5%, and it continues to accelerate and grow very, very dramatically. Why is that? That's one of the benefits of aging, because here you are and you retire, all of a sudden what happens? You're no longer ensnared in the Shanai Bunka, in this corporate prison. All of a sudden you've got free time. And, you know, yes, the Japanese people fundamentally do want to do good. And from that perspective, I think it's very, very encouraging to see that, you know, there is a genuinely new economy. Volunteering, not-for-profit, is a high-growth sector here in Japan.
Okay. So since the Agriculture Committee is supporting this, I thought I'd have at least one agriculture slide. So this is a number of deaths in agricultural accidents by age.
Excellent statistic, Bill. Thank you.
So this is when people are driving tractors on the road, or sometimes inside their farms, and you'll see there that I can't see the number, like 47% of the people who die in agricultural accidents are age 80 and above, right? Which gives you an idea of what's happening in the Japanese farming industry. And 80-something% are over the age of 65. So, I mean, this is where agriculture is. And so even though Mr. Trump doesn't want TPP would be good for Japan, right? Because we're going to have to open up this agriculture business, because you just cannot continue to have an industry like this. Sorry to make that to the Agriculture Committee. Is that all right? That's all right. Okay, thank you. Okay.
So what you're saying is if you're driving in the countryside and you see a tractor, get the hell out of the way. Okay, that makes sense. A lot of my time is trying to figure out how to make 1 + 1 = 11. If you look at the human side plus the technology side and bringing those together and finding the synergy between those two, the number becomes 11. It's very interesting with what's happening in our lives with technology and finding the balance with the human side. So that brings us wonderfully. We do have time for some Q&A. So anything anybody wants to follow up on, ask any of the different panelists. My lovely assistant over here, Paul.
And do they have to phrase their question with a letter or something like that?
They don't have to.
Okay.
And you said they needed to state their... Name
and affiliation.
Name and affiliation.
Thanks, Patrick. Greg Story from Dale Carnegie Training. Question for Jesper. That slide you had on the population decline and the employment going up. Can we expect that as the population declines and the market for consumer goods declines, that the Japanese economy will go into a major downturn, at which point the requirement for employment need will also similarly decline, and therefore, even though that graph at the moment is showing an upswing, over the long term, is that actually going to go down? Because you would think, logically, less people, less consumption, therefore less demand for companies to have workers, or are we looking at something else?
No, you're looking at something else. I mean, first of all, this is just maths. It's just a ratio, right? So that's, the employment, the participation rate in Japan is going up. As many of you know, the female participation rate in Japan is now higher than it is in the United States of America. Japan is one of the few countries where the people are actually coming out from the woodworks wanting to participate back in the economy here, right? So it's quite interesting. The participation rate today overall for male-female is around 78%, right? In, for example, the Scandinavian economies, you've got participation rates of around 82, 85%. So there's a significant buffer that you still have to absorb. Your point, though, is interesting. As you get old, your patterns of consumption change. I mean, just look at what Bill told us about. You want stuff for your knee. You want creature comforts. You don't want to drive a tractor, right? So the shift towards creature comforts, towards a more service-intensive economy is going to be growing. But the exciting thing, of course, is, right, that all of these services are labor-intensive. Right? I'm on one of these government advisory committees, and they talk about the shortage of nurses, right? A big shortage of nurses, around 800,000 people, big shortage of nurses there. And they say, well, what's the solution? Well, one of them is going to be that we have robots, right? And I always raise my hand and I said, I'm terribly sorry, I love Japan to death, right? But if you're telling me that in my future a robot is going to change my diaper, I'm leaving.
Thank you.
But it is an interesting balance in some ways, because they say, Michael Osborne, I was on a panel from Oxford University, says 46% of jobs will be new jobs in the next 10 years in Japan. And then what percentage of those are actually going to be taken over by AI and bots? And I guess in some ways it solves the problem here about immigration, and then also having the right gaijins in Japan. So will they be able to train the bots and the AI how to be culturally sensitive to Japan is the question I have.
One of the other, just following on from Jesper's thing, it's a great question, Greg, but, one of the things that people don't take into account, and Florian is somewhere in the room, he's an ageing expert, we both do a lot of work on ageing populations. A lot of research, a lot of evidence says that in Japan, as well as other developed countries, people 65 after retirement, at roughly 60, 65, whichever year that is, in the first 5 to 10 years, after retirement, their daily, weekly, monthly and annual expenditures all go up compared to the 5 to 10 years before retirement. And so why is that? Changing lifestyles, and the most important thing, which goes to your reason why parts of the economy are growing, like volunteerism, non-profit organisations, is you've gone from, in Japan, from working the overworked, I'm going to die of death by work, 70, 80 hours a week. What am I going to do? You can't play golf for 80 hours a week. Right? You can't afford it for a start. You can't watch television for 80 hours a week because you'll literally jump out the window. So what you're doing off is you're exploring the world. And then we see massive growth, not only in healthcare, but in exploration categories. Everything from tourism through to reading, through to entertainment of all forms. It's all going to explode.
Right. Can I add one thing on that, which, is actually my favorite number on Japan, right? It's 48%. 48% of all Japanese over the age of 20, 48% of all Japanese over the age of 20 have no debt. There's no student debt, there's no credit card debt, there's no mortgage debt. But those 48% own the home that they live in. They are incredibly asset rich. They've got all these deposits on top of that. So me retiring, all of a sudden, exactly to your point, I've got time and I do have purchasing power. It's not income-based, because it's not from the source of employment anymore, right? But I do have assets that are being drawn out. So from that perspective, this is the richest baby boom generation in the world that is retiring. And that's an enormous amount of purchasing power that's being unleashed.
And to go to the purchasing, then we're going to go around in circles around this, but to go to the purchasing thing, a lot of research that we've been involved in across 5 different key segments, things from cosmetics through to automobiles, key consumer segments in the marketplace in Japan. And one of the things we're finding is massive continual growth in online and mobile shopping. But please remember, online shopping and online purchasing are 2 totally different activities. Most of the measurement combines them. So, for example, when you look at international comparisons, Japan still lags most developed countries in terms of online shopping. What they actually mean is online purchasing. Actually, Japan is amongst the heaviest online shoppers in the world, and the fastest growing area of online shopping is people between 60 and 85 in Japan. Actually, in some studies, it's the fastest growing segment of online shopping in the world is a Japanese between 60 and 85. But they want to go and buy it in the flesh because they've got nothing else to do. Plenty of time to shop online and then go and buy it in the flesh. So you've got to understand the difference whenever you're figuring out your marketing selling programs.
Did they get the 10% discount if they could have their driver's license?
So, well, just to follow on Jesper's one as well. I mean, about a week ago, I was down at the National Institute of Gerontology in Nagoya, which is.
You have a knee problem? Would you like to stand up?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting too old. I have to sit down. Yeah. Okay. But one of the big issues coming up is dementia for Japan, right? Because the baby boomers will, at 2025, will all be 75 plus. And the calculations have been made that 1 in 3 people over the age of 65 are going to have some form of cognitive impairment, let's put it simply, right? Which means 10 million Japanese are going to be wandering around the streets saying, what the hell is my name, right? This is, if you're talking about service business, right? So one of the issues is we're going to have to train doctors, to train nurses. We're going to have to train bank tellers, because what's happening already, people are walking into the bank saying, you stole my money, because they don't remember their PIN code, right? And then in supermarkets, they're having problems now. They come in, they drop the pants like Dave does and just shone all over the, right? And they, not because they're trying to be bad, they just feel they need to go. So this is where a big issue coming forward for Japan, right? So be aware, those of you getting that age, this could happen to you. So try to find someone who's going to look after you, okay?
Next question. Yeah. Wow, I've never seen you move that fast, Paul.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'm Amanda from the USA Girl Scouts, and I had a question going back to jails, actually. I thought your statistics were really interesting, particularly around the percentage and amount of Japanese that were actually in jail compared to the population. And I think we all feel very safe in Japan, and so do you think that those statistics are particularly because Japanese people just abide by the law, or are there fundamental differences between the legal system in Japan versus, for example, the US or China, and the way not only prosecutions are taken out or conducted, but also within the regulations and the level of crimes in order to be prosecuted?
That's a very difficult question to answer after lunch. First of all, one of the problems for the United States is you have a very large number of lawyers, right? There's like, at last count, there was 870,000 lawyers in the United States and 17,000 in Japan, which probably explains a lot, right? I think there's a social side quite in Japan. But I mean, I think US, if you saw those numbers, is just staggering, right? The number of people either in jail and or as a percentage of the population is just staggering. I think it's basically because US is a law, everything's legal, right? Japanese contracts, one-page contract, I love you, you love me, that's it. I've done deals in, big companies, and they want a 400-page contract and 28 lawyers getting involved, right? So I think that's the fundamental difference. Plus there's a social side as well. But I'd be happy, Dave, you want to have a comment, or Jesper? On that, I mean, it's an interesting topic.
It's because Japan is... David?
It's a really interesting subject. A few years ago, I was in a voluntary group helping released jail releasees here. And the number of discussions about... in America, we talk about recidivism as a contractual thing that the system is not helping people to get out. The discussion here was automatically, I think I might go back in. It's just easier. I think one of the bigger issues in Japan, of course, is the downside of Japanese societies. We often talk about the fact that there are only small minorities and the minorities are repressed, and that's usually an argument against immigration. But there's a major reason why the US in particular has such high levels, and it's very, very large minorities that are, it seems, unduly picked on. And by the way, that's the case in China as well. Now, the minorities are not, well, partly ethnic and partly religious, but it's the same reasons. When you have a homogenous society, you don't get picked on so much.
Mr. J?
Just in terms of numbers, I mean, it's wonderful to be poor in Japan, right? This is an economy that works extremely well for the lowest common denominator here, right? School dropout rates and things like that are teeny compared to where you are, in many other countries, including the United States. Japan, again, manages for the lowest common denominator, right? It's equality of outcome, right? It is impossible to eat badly here in Japan. I mean, look at the numbers you ask about, and I haven't done the correlations to the prison population, but certainly, if you look at the data, in the United States, 1/3 of all households, 1/3 of all households do not have financial assets in excess of $10,000. Right? In Japan, right, that number is just around 7%, right? So it's very, very interesting, how, you can look at the system here and, there's a lot of issues, right? But, the reality is that, what do you guys call that? There was a political slogan at some point, nobody left behind, right? Works extremely well.
Right, next question.
We have time for one more.
Yeah, one more question, yeah.
Just one additional comment. I think the other point is the age. I mean, most people go to jail when they're younger. They're breaking laws all the time. So what we now have is a much older population, so probably less inclined to break the laws as much as younger people as well. So that could be another answer to the question.
Last question. Do we have one more? Have you been working out recently, Paul? I can see that. Looking good.
Thank you. Heather McLeish, EY Japan Climate Change and Sustainability Services. My question is for all three of you gentlemen, and a little bit off topic slightly. But when we're looking at the future of Japan, let's just focus on the future of Tokyo. So Koike-san now is very much talking about bringing foreign direct investment back to Japan, and particularly talking about Tokyo as a smart city. How do you think her vision of the smart city is going to work? Do you think it will work? And what areas of the economy do you think this will spark?
You want to start, Jesper?
Oh.
Are you sure?
Yes. I'm conflicted.
That is so rare. I mean, really, am I speaking
too
to the
close
same
to
person
home.
here?
Have a think about it. One of the issues is I understand, and I think I've great respect for, I guess, Koike-san and what she's saying. One of the issues is that how many cities in the world are talking about exactly the same thing, whether it's city government or national governments? We have whole companies now that are developing smart cities. One organisation, a good friend of mine is working with, is now developing 50 cities, mostly in the Middle East. They're all cities of between 50 and 100,000 people. They are smart cities. They are driverless cities. There are absolutely no vehicles allowed in the cities. They are all fully connected. They're all fully 100% Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi cities that will be built. So with all companies that are being invited to participate in these companies, either as residents, to have residents living there, to put in manufacturing or any type of business in there, with extreme tax breaks. So what's going to be the differentiation? Now, is it, in the case of Japan, is it going to be catch-up to what is now becoming the norm for, say, a Singapore, for example, who's probably seen as the primary, connected city of the world at the moment, or all these new cities that are being built, literally sometimes in the middle of the desert, the middle of the jungle, or being rebuilt as satellites within existing cities. Easier to do on scale, 50, 100,000 people, massively changing Tokyo, it's going to be a big problem. I just wonder, because when we see that, and I think it's necessary to stay competitive, I'm not too sure it's going to be differentiating in any way in the future. It's just going to be doing what We expect big cities to do. And the problem for Japan is, I always go back to my Olympics example. Bill and I are old enough to remember, as kids, the impact of the Olympics on young Australians in 1964. And the primary thing we remember is Astro Boy, because it was launched around the world in 1964. So as a little kid, I'm sitting in the suburbs of Sydney dreaming of Astro Boy and thinking that represented what Tokyo was today in 1964. And remember too, Astro Boy, when you watch the original TV series, what year was it set in? Way off in the future in 1993. So the problem for Japan in saying these things is the perception in the outside world quite often is that it's more advanced than it really is already. And so when you say, well, we're going to become a connector, but aren't you already? Aren't you, what do you mean, Japan's not there already? And so there's an expectation level expected of Japan in that sense that I think they're going to find hard to reach up to.
But interesting, one of the reasons I wanted to bring Singularity to Japan was that I found out through speaking with my friends that Japan is behind in almost every area of technology. And it needs a real wake-up call. And that's really the
Can I just really cut in there into the glip? Japan is way advanced in all areas of technology that are actually being used. Anybody use the subway here?
How did we miss this?
Which
in a
subway would you rather use? No, but I mean, look at this. I mean, there's this wonderful debate about self-driving cars. Self-driving cars, this, self-driving cars, that. Excuse me, it's called a subway. I mean, and by the way, it works. Tokyo is the only place that continuously invests in its subway. They are changing the toilets into refresh stations, right? So that even the young girls and the young boys go there to actually do their makeup here. So I think, you want to be very, very careful. Smart, you can catch up. There's a lot of catching up that may or may not be necessary, whatever. How is Tokyo differentiated? And I don't want to sound like an old guy now. Tokyo is differentiated by the fact that they smile at you. The fact that there is such a thing as service. There is not a machine, there is a service. Maybe a machine is more efficient, economically speaking, but I love when the bank teller smiles at me and it takes half an hour to change a check.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, okay. I think to attract foreign investment, one of the issues is going to be tax, right? And Japan has lost already, and the tax is too high. I mean, this is your area, Jesper, but why is everyone going to Singapore, Hong Kong, and getting out of Japan? Because of the taxations. How are you going to get people to come in and invest in Japan if you don't have reasonable taxation issues, right? And then in what sort of investment, to come back to Dave's point, right? Almost all of the inventions that a lot of these young entrepreneurs are doing is thinking only of selling in Japan, right? Whereas if you go to Silicon Valley, before you can get funding from Silicon Valley, you have to have a global strategy, right? Right from the beginning. Most young Japanese entrepreneurs don't have a global strategy. So if you want to educate Koike-san, get them to have a global strategy as well, not just a one in Japan. Right?
All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for coming once again. And thank you, gentlemen. If you could come up here for the obligatory picture. We'll take a quick picture and give these guys some mugs. And again, thank you very much. You will be, and don't forget to fill out your forms. And I think these guys will be here for another 5-10 minutes if you want to say hello. Thank you again, and have a good afternoon.